I'm Randall Eichenberger, Chief Operations and Maintenance for the Lake Michigan area office. I work out of Appleton, Wisconsin. We are part of Detroit District. Myself, I have Anthony Vogel. He's our heavy equipment operator out of our office. So we kind of work hand in hand with our area along Lake Winnebago and the Lower Fox River, in addition to harbors on Lake Michigan that have federal structures. Going to kind of just cover different means and different methods of sandbag placement, exactly what's the best way to create a sandbag wall, whether if it's right up along the river frontage or if you're going to encapsulate a garage or your house, different means and methods. There's other structures you can use above and beyond sandbags. We'll cover a little bit on that. The biggest thing to kind of take away, if at all, you walk out of here tonight, if you're going to do sandbags, fill them half to 3/4 full of sand. Sand itself, if you can't get sand, you could use dirt, but sand is preferable because once you throw it on the ground, it's going to kind of mold to the contour of the ground that you're building a wall on, where if you have dirt or clay, it's not going to exactly work the greatest. And then the other thing, you can leave them untied because you want to have your wall, say if you're out here building the wall along the river, you're going to want to have the end of the bags untied but going with the flow of the water. So to prevent, you don't have to take the time of tying them. And then the other point is, so if you want to build a 3-foot tall sandbag wall, you're going to want them to be 9 sandbags wide. That's going to give you your stability, that's going to give you your structure to prevent that water from knocking over your wall. It's a lot of sandbags. We do have numbers on some of the slides. So I'll start just kind of going through, and we can, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand and we'll answer them as best as we can. We always tell people half full to 3/4 full of sand. One of the biggest reasons, weight. That gives you approximately 40 to 50 pounds. That's before it's wet. So anything more than that, that's just more hard work. This is manual labor. It's not exactly the most enjoyable work you could be doing outside. There's obviously two different types of bags, burlap and plastic. Plastic holds up a little bit better. Whatever you can buy works. Here's a kind of a first layout that we show building a sandbag wall. The biggest thing to kind of take away is on the water's edge. So if you're building right up along the Wolf River, you want to start with putting plastic on the bottom course, and you want to have that plastic along the water side. One reason is to prevent the water, or out here obviously the current, of starting to deteriorate away from your sandbag wall. So that we usually recommend a 6mm plastic, a little bit heavier duty, that'll help prevent not only just the water, but then also UV radiation from breaking down the bags and starting to expose them to the weather. And what you can do is tie that plastic back over and then throw just one course on top of the sandbag wall to keep it in place. Because given the weather, you might get wind that might blow it off, and then depending on what the water height might be, you might not be able to retrieve it. Go back through. And then here's kind of some of the numbers to kind of grasp how much it takes per 100 feet to do a 3-foot tall sandbag wall and take 4,500 sandbags. It's a lot. Think of this as your best case, your best protection of layering these bags one course at a time and then basically making a pyramid. That's textbook sandbag wall. Depending on what you have to work with, how big of an area you have to try to cover, try to protect, it's really completely up to you. I mean, there's no perfect textbook situation out there on a property or along a water's edge. It's really, there's just a lot of, based off of what conditions you might have. I mean, out here you're dealing with current, you're not necessarily dealing with wave action that a landowner might have on the South Bay Shore in Brown County. Let's get that going through. Here's some different kind of ideas of what we've seen that's out there. But basically just this is probably only about 1.5 feet tall. Again, going wider at the base till you get to the top of the sandbag wall. One of the other, this is obviously overkill, probably fits that situation, but for a private homeowner, you wouldn't necessarily need to have a diesel-powered pump. What you can do is similar size to what your sump pump would be in your basement. If you're able to keep your power cords dry, have an area on the dry side of your wall to pump what water accumulates back over. Because that still might happen, especially rainfall. You're still going to probably collect water on what you want as your dry side. You want to be able to get that water out of there. This one's another good photo if you're able to kind of see it clear enough of how they're utilizing the plastic. They actually laid the plastic down on the ground first, then started building their wall on top of it, so then they're able to tie that plastic over what's going to be the wet side of that wall, and then eventually would top it off with another course of sandbags to keep it in place. And this is just another small wall that a landowner built to kind of protect everything else along this side from being inundated. And as you can see, it's really where you need to build it. It's what you have to work with, where you need to have it built at. I mean, there's nothing that, what we're just going through is what's textbook. You know, what has been tried and true, if you have the time, if you have the sand, if you have the labor. Another thing that we've seen different places try is they'll build basically a wall out of plywood or sheets of OSB and build supports behind it and then put sandbags in front of that. That's another thing that we've seen property owners do in front of, say, their garage or their driveway or their water's edge. So there's different means or methods to it.
One of the things that's big bonus to that OSB backboard back there is I personally built some of these sandbag walls before. It gets real tiring. It's very labor intensive. With that having the support behind it, you're eliminating that pyramid factor behind it. You know, you're saving a lot of time and energy on that. And then you would do the same as well with wrapping that 6 mil plastic over the top of there to try and make that as watertight as possible.
What we've also recommended other homeowners do along their house, if they're going to have to sandbag right along their foundation, is to put plastic right up along, almost kind of from their box sill down to the ground. And even if it's as easy as using duct tape, whatever you can get to keep that plastic up against the foundation, and then put sandbags on the ground with that plastic underneath them to keep that in place, to try to keep a vapor barrier against your foundation to stop that water from getting to it and touching it. And then what we've also recommended homeowners to do is to cover up with boards your window wells in a basement area, to try to cover that up and put plastic and sandbags to protect that. One of the things, we kind of cover this is very more prone down south with a major levee system, depending on what a landowner, where you might be located along the river. A sand boil is something that you might see where water from the river and the current is piping underneath the shoreline and then coming up on the dry side somewhere. And they'll pop up where it's almost like a little geyser that's kind of bubbling up through the ground. And the way that a person can contain it is you basically build a sandbag ring around it. So this will work. So what I've personally seen, and it depends, every sand boil is different. And I'm just covering this in case gee whiz information that someone sees this on their property or you see it somewhere else along the river. But you basically build a sandbag ring around this water hole in the ground, and you build it high enough to the point where the water's not spilling over the sandbags. That's equalizing pressure from where the water's coming from the river to that spot on the ground. I don't think it's really a whole too common along the Wolf River. We don't have a massive levee system here like along the Mississippi. And for in the city, especially with some of the city employees here, we've seen the same thing used in other communities where, let's say along the Bayshore, where they're having issues with floodwater coming up through the storm system. And they'll put almost like a sand boil ring around that stormwater drain to equalize pressure so it's not inundating a street or other public infrastructure in that area. In the winter, that's kind of a problem with snow removal and ice. Obviously, once we're in flood season, that's kind of a problem with drainage, but for a short-term solution, it does work. And these are some other pictures of sandbag walls. Let me go back to that one for a second. Kind of a quick, easy way. Some communities have sandbag fillers, some don't. What we've seen is what this community did. They had a 4x8 sheet of plywood, cut holes in it, lobbed off the ends of cones, stuck the cones in those holes so you could sit with a sandbag, fill it up, someone else shovels in it. It's an easy, a little more of an efficient way of filling sandbags. Still labor intensive, but a lot better than just opening up the bag and dumping sand in it with the shovel. These are motorized sandbag machines. Some Corps of Engineer offices have them. We do not have one locally. And this is another picture of a fairly tall sandbag wall that was put up. And some of these are pictures of communities around Lake St. Clair area up by Detroit, Michigan. I mentioned earlier that there's other larger flood protection methods than sandbags. What these are HESCO barriers. They're basically kind of like an accordion style metal that's put out like a metal fabric, kind of like a chain link fence, and then there's canvas material that's inside of it, and then with the machine you would fill that up with dirt, sand, gravel, and it creates a barrier.
So the pros to doing a HESCO barrier like that is that you can cover a lot more space and you can build a higher wall a lot faster. Like Randall said, that they do have like a metal outer casing on there, like a chain link fence, so you can dump some heavier stuff in there, and obviously with use of a skid steer and other piece of equipment, it goes a lot faster. With those, you'd still, if you have the opportunity, you'd still want to use that 6 mil plastic on the outside, once again, to try and keep that as watertight as possible to stop that from penetrating through your HESCO barriers. The downside to them is that they're metal on the sides and metal on the bottom, so if you're going over rough terrain or where it might be uneven, it's going to be very hard to seal that bottom edge down there to keep that water from coming through.
See if that'll work. Oh, there it goes. A couple more pictures of what these HESCO barriers look like. These aren't exactly something that individual property owners acquire. It's usually the county or municipality. They do spend the money and may purchase these if they have a need.
Is that a one-time use for them?
Yes, there's really not a good way of recycling those. It's pretty much once you put them up and fill them, the material's going to get wet after a flood event. There's really not a way that you could reuse those. What we've used specifically to our own office, it's kind of similar to what HESCOs are, but it's more like a super sack. It's a plastic, larger sandbag, and we use the skid steer to fill them, and then a forklift to place them because they would have pick points on the four corners. A much larger bag, but just as labor intensive with a machine, but then you could potentially reuse those if you can dump them out. And this picture is kind of just showing what a sump pit could look like. Obviously for a house or a homeowner, you wouldn't need anything that extensive with a 55-gallon drum, even just a 5-gallon pail. You dig a little hole, put your sump pump in there, then run your hose up over wherever your water side of your sandbag wall would be, to at least try to keep that dry area inside wet from collecting water, or dry from collecting water. Just kind of some concerns regarding the structure itself. Obviously, once you go through a weather event and obviously a flood event itself, those bags are going to be wet. They're going to be heavier than when you placed them in the dry. What are you kind of building for? How long of a timeline do you expect that you might need the wall up for or encapsulate the foundation of a house for? And then basically, what's the condition of the sandbags that you're using to build your structure? And then something for the county or the city. Other municipalities have dealt with this and plan accordingly. But after a major flood event, what does a homeowner do with the bags? Some places will have a collection point. Some places let you bring them to a municipal landfill. That's something that would have to communicate with the county or the city. What I do know that we've received from the Weather Service, that outside of the snowfall this winter, they have told us that the ground saturation, which I'm sure all you here know as well, is in the 99 percentile of water saturation. They have never seen this before. They were telling us on the phone it's unprecedented. So they're expecting flooding in multiple areas, not just along the Wolf River Basin. And this was from the Weather Service office in the Milwaukee area and Sullivan. So they're expecting flooding down there in a lot of the river communities. And the same thing definitely for our area, even not only the Wolf River, the Fox River as well. What it may crest at, it's too early to tell. We do, locally we have a water gauge right here in New London that we do maintain and monitor daily, so we do know what the water level is here. The USGS has water gauges further upstream on the Wolf River Basin. So we do have data of what the water is doing on a daily basis.
So one thing to remember with that, with the saturation being in that 99th percentile, is you got to, keep in mind that when all the snow melts, it has nowhere to go except for in the river. When it rains, it has nowhere to go except for in the river, in the storm system. So just keep that in mind, that there's nothing there to soak up anything. It's going to lead to higher water levels.
We'll probably get one more.
That's enough?
Yeah, that should be.
Okay. So, yep, go right ahead.
I guess you could put a little more in there, but.
So, as you can see, we got it just about a half to 3/4 the way full. And the reason why, we're also not going to tie it. So if you imagine that the water is flowing this direction, like a vehicle would pull in through here, you're going to fold this top down and lift it up and just give it a little toss and step on it. All right, what you're kind of looking for is like a Lego. If you've ever had a kid, you've stepped on one before. You're going to want it a little flat. You're going to want it square. Now the reason behind this is so that when you stack them on there, you're going to stack them just like Legos, next to each other, one on top, until you build that height that you're looking for. The reason why we fold it is so that it keeps it square on this end, so you get more surface area right here, and they'll connect better. If you tie it and you fill it too high, you get this. And as we stack the next bag on top, you'll actually be able to see the small gaps that are underneath it.